So if you're watching a recorded lecture, make sure that, again, you take down everything that I've talked about. In addition to all the examples that I'm going to go over, you also need to write down these key points here for this lesson. So today, I've been talking about this a little bit, but today we're going to be solving literal equations. And another way that you might see a question that involves solving literal equations is if it says solve for this variable in terms of another variable, okay? So that in terms of, that tells you that you're going to be solving a literal equation. And what that means is you're still going to be following all your regular inverse operation steps, but this time you're not going to come up with just a number as a solution. You're going to have x, or whatever the variable you're solving for, equals, and then a whole expression. So you'll see it's not too difficult. Again, if you're good with inverse operations, then you'll be fine with today's lesson. The two things that I did want to point out, so there is kind of a, if you can think about like PEMDAS is what we use order of operations going forward. We do have like a reverse order of operations. And so if you're trying to solve for a variable, we're not going to see any of these with parentheses today, but if you did have parentheses, you want to work from the outside in. So if you had parentheses, you're going to start with anything that's added or subtracted outside the parentheses. And then you would go to anything that's multiplied or divided outside the parentheses, okay? And then after you got rid of everything outside the parentheses, then you move to the inside, and it's the same steps. So it's always, if you're going backwards, always start by undoing addition and subtraction, and then undo multiplication and division, okay? So those are the main things that we're going to use. You're going to see these in the examples. Again, if you are watching the recorded lecture, got to get these down and all the examples, okay? So we'll start with number one. Number one is pretty easy. It's m plus n equals 14. And if you notice in the directions, it says solve for m. So we're trying to solve for this variable n, okay? Now, like I said, because we're solving these literal equations, we're not just going to get a number, okay? So it's not just a number as an answer. It's going to be a number plus a variable, or a number minus a variable. So if we're solving for m, we're going to undo everything that's being done to n. So if we're adding an n, remember from inverse operations, the inverse of addition is subtraction. And if we subtract an n on one side, we have to subtract it on the other side, okay? So n minus n, well, that's 0. So all we have left over here is m. And then on this side, well, a 14 and a negative n, those are not like terms. We cannot combine those at all. So the only thing we can do is write them as separate terms, 14 minus n, and that's your final answer, okay? Now, another answer that would be totally acceptable would be negative n plus 14. Remember, this commutative property says that the way that you write the order in which you write numbers doesn't matter when we're adding and subtracting. Okay, so check the questions. So, yep, in this case here, it looks like my video went out. I'll have to fix that real quick. Okay, cool. So Makani, did I answer your question there? So for this one here, we just subtracted the n. When we subtracted the n, we just had 14 minus n, and that was it. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the second question. In the second question, we have a minus b minus 5, and we're solving for a. Okay, so P equals A minus B minus 5. And it said solve for A. It's John. Okay, well, if we're solving for this A, that means that we need to get rid of everything that's being done to this A. So on this side, we have a negative B. We also have a negative 5. So we need to get rid of both of these things in order to get this A by itself. okay? So how do we get rid of a negative b? Well, it's pretty easy. We just add a b. How do we get rid of a negative 5? Well, again, that's pretty easy too. Just add 5, because negative b plus b is 0. Negative 5 plus 5 is 0. Okay. Now, if we do something to one side, remember, you got to do it to the other side of your equal sign. So we need to also add a b, and we also need to add 5 over here. So on this side, these will cancel. We'll have a left over by itself. And then on this other side, remember, the commutative property says it does not matter the order in which we write these. So we could put this as p plus b plus 5. We could write this as b plus p plus 5. You guys know permutations, combinations, the order. If we said the order matters here, there's 6 different ways that we could write this. I'm not going to write them all out, but as long as you have a p plus b plus 5 in your answer, that would be correct. No, there is no specific order. And remember, the reason for that is the commutative property. So when we're talking about real numbers, p plus b plus 5 is the same thing as b plus p plus 5. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. I think you're probably getting the hang of these addition and subtraction problems, but I do want to give you one more example where we have both addition and subtraction. So for the next one, we have p equals r plus s minus 1. Plus s minus 1, okay? And it's asking us to solve for r. So if we're asked to solve for r, again, we have to undo anything that is being done on the side of this. Solve for r? I'm tripping. Solve for r. So we have to undo everything that's being done on this side of the r. So if we have a positive s, the way that you undo addition is with subtraction. Okay, well, we have a negative 1, so the way that we can undo this negative 1 is by adding 1. Okay, now remember, if we do it to one side, we need to do it to the other side. So we have a negative s and a plus 1. So this would be p minus s plus 1 equals r. Okay, again, there's multiple ways that you could write this as a correct answer. The thing that's important is the sign on your terms. So it would need to be a negative s, a positive p, and a positive 1. As long as you have a negative s, positive p, and a positive 1, then that's the right solution. Okay, so those were some addition and subtraction problems. If you have any questions, go ahead, post those in the chat right now. If not, we will move on to some multiplication and division. All right, so on to the multiplication and division. Now remember, we haven't got to this yet, but if you do have multiple operations, so let's say you have addition and multiplication, the order in which you do them, add and subtract first, so do that inverse operation first, then do your multiplication and division, okay? So this is what we would do like last if we were doing these inverse operations and we had both addition and multiplication. All right, so the next one says solve for a. We have h equals a over 8, okay? Now, I'm going to show you 3 different ways to solve this, and you're going to see, like, it depends on what problem you're solving in real life, when you're in college or wherever, but there's multiple ways you can solve these problems with ratios. So the first one is just through inverse operations. So again, if we're solving for this a, we have to undo anything that's being done to it. So if it's a divided by 8, the inverse of division is multiplication. So we would need to multiply this side by 8. And if we do something to one side, we would also have to do it to the other side. So these would cancel out, and we would get a equals 8h, or 8 times h, okay? Now, again, like I said, that's one way that you could solve this problem, okay? Now, another way you could solve this problem is recognizing that h by itself is the same thing as h over 1. And if we set that equal to A over 8, we now have a ratio that's set equal to another ratio, okay? And in this case, this is like a trick that my high school physics teacher taught me. Anytime that you have a ratio equal to another ratio, you can switch the diagonals and it's the same thing, okay? So I can switch this H and this 8 and it's the same thing. So I would have, so actually, you know what? That wouldn't even help us there. So I take that back. That, I mean, it wouldn't help us at all because we would get H over, or 8 over 1 equals A over H, and that's not going to help. But if you have two ratios, something that you can use, and I talked about this in the last lesson, is cross multiplication. So we would multiply this H times this 8. So this is H times 8. And you set that equal to your other cross multiplication, which is A times 1. Well, A times 1 is just A by itself, right? And then H times 8 is 8H. Okay, so you see we end up getting the exact same solution. We can either use this cross multiplication and then division, or we can just think of this as inverse operations. Okay, so again, the reason that I show you this is that cross multiplication does help out in a lot of situations, and it's something that you can always go back to if you're having trouble. Okay, so that was the first multiplication problem. Let's move on to the second one. Okay, in the second one, we have 4G equals W, and it wants us to solve for G, okay? So in this one here, again, easiest thing to do is just think, okay, well, what's the opposite of multiplying by 4? Dividing by 4. So we divide this side by 4, and 4 divided by 4 is 1, or 4G divided by 4 would just be G. If you divide one side by 4, you've got to divide the other side by 4. So G would equal W over 4. Okay. Now, I do want to show you one other way that you could look at this. So if we think of this as 4G equals W, if we didn't want to think of like the inverse of multiplication being division, we can always think about multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 4 over 1 is 1 over 4. So instead of dividing both sides by 4, what we could do is multiply both sides by 1/4, and that would cancel out the 4. So G would also be equal to 1/4 W. 1/4 W is the same thing as W divided by 4. So there's two different ways that you can think of it and two different ways that you could write your answer. All right, any questions about those so far? Doesn't look like it. So let's jump to the last multiplication and division problem, and then we'll do a couple where you have multiple operations, and we'll show the order in which we have to do those. Okay, so the last one we have here is W equals A over 5. And it's asking you to solve for A, okay? So again, just like what we did in the first problem, this row here, we can look at this a couple ways. So the first way we can look at this is we have division going on, and the opposite of division is multiplication. So if we multiply this side by 5, then the 5s will cancel out, and we'll have A. And then on this side, 5 times W is 5W. Okay. But I do want you to remember the cross multiplication method. So the cross multiplication method would say, okay, we got W over 1 equals A over 5. When we cross multiply, 1 times A is just A, and then W times 5 is 5W. So again, you can do it either way. You can think of it as inverse operations, or you can think of it as my favorite, cross multiplication. Either way, you get to the same solution. Okay, so that was all the practice that we're going to do. If you just had one inverse operation to do, or there was, just addition or subtraction, now we're going to look at if you have multiple. So if we're adding and subtracting and multiplying or dividing, what do you have to do? So again, it goes back to the steps. If you have parentheses, first thing you have to remember is you work outside to in. So we get rid of any addition or subtraction outside the parentheses first, then we get rid of any multiplication outside the parentheses or division. And then after we get rid of the parentheses, then again, we start with addition on the inside of the parentheses and then finish off with multiplication or division on the inside of the parentheses. So let's go ahead and start. This one is z equals 2x minus y. And it wants you to solve for x, okay? So again, we're trying to solve for this variable. So like I said, you always start with addition and subtraction. So we have 2 times this x and then minus y. So we're going to start with this minus y. The opposite of subtraction is addition. So I'm going to add a y to both sides. On this side, we now have z plus y because we cannot combine those like terms. And that's equal to 2 times x. Okay? So, like I said, the second thing you do after you do your addition and subtraction is your multiplication and your division. So in this case here, if we were trying to get the x by itself, we had 2 times x. So the opposite of multiplication is division. If we divide one side by 2, we need to divide the other side by 2. So my final answer, z plus y over 2 equals x. Okay. So another way that you could do that last step is just multiplying by 1/2. So 1/2 z plus y is the same thing as z plus y over 2. No difference. Okay, any questions on the multi-step? So if you remember, you always got to think work outside to in, and then it's addition, inverse addition and subtraction first, and then inverse addition, inverse multiplication and division second. All right, last problem. All right, so the last one we've got here is D equals 5m plus 11n. M plus 11n, and it wants you to solve for this n. Okay, so like I said, start with addition and subtraction. We've got this 5m plus the 11n, so we're going to want to subtract 5m here. If we do that on one side, remember, got to do it on the other side. So that would leave us on this left side. You can't combine a d and an m. So we have d minus 5m equals, and then on this side, we have 11n. So after we do addition and subtraction, then the next thing we have to do is multiplication or division. So in this case, we have 11 times n. I'll do it the other way, just to kind of show you. We could multiply by 1 over 11, and that would cancel out, just leaving us with n. So if we multiply by 1 over 11 on that side, we also have to multiply by 1 over 11 on this side. So an answer would be 1 over 11 times d minus 5m equals n. Again, if you want to think of this as division instead, you divide by 11, and so this is one answer. The other answer that we could possibly have would be d minus 5m over 11. Okay, so I want you to recognize both of them. Alex accepts both as the correct answer, but if you're taking that placement test like I was talking about, that you're gonna have to take like before your freshman year of college, it might be multiple choice, and you might see this when you think the answer is supposed to be this, but just understand that they're the exact same thing. Okay?